A calm, moonlit Pacific night where the sea looks too shallow, too innocent, almost laughably safe for warships to fear. And that false sense of security is exactly where this story begins. Because while Japanese officers scanned the deep blue horizons during World War II, convinced that enemy submarines could only survive in abyssal depths, Allied submariners were already there, silently crouched like predators in waters so shallow that charts said it was impossible, rewriting the rules of naval warfare without firing a single warning shot. And this single miscalculation would slowly bleed the Japanese empire from below, ship by ship, crew by crew, supply line by supply line, as the U.S. Navy and its allied partners turned bath-warm coastal seas, coral-studded straits, and narrow shipping lanes into killing grounds that Tokyo never truly understood until it was far too late. Japanese naval doctrine before and during the early years of the war was shaped by decades of belief that submarines were fragile deep-water hunters, vulnerable in shallow seas to mines, aircraft, and coastal patrols, a belief reinforced by pre-war exercises, German experiences in World War I, and even by Japan's own submarine strategy, which emphasized fleet engagement and long-range patrols rather than sustained commerce raiding, as described by historians like Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully in Shattered Sword, and by Clay Blair in Silent Victory. Yet the Americans, driven by desperation after Pearl Harbor and guided by a ruthless learning curve, began to experiment, adopt, and ultimately exploit precisely those waters the Japanese thought were safe, slipping diesel-electric submarines into depths of less than 100 feet, sometimes barely deeper than the length of the boat itself, where one wrong trim adjustment could smash a hull into the seabed or expose a periscope like a raised finger pointing to death. But these crews learned to hug the bottom, to rest their boats in the mud, to use thermal layers and coastal clutter to confuse sonar, and most importantly to ambush Japanese convoys, where escorts were few, air cover was thin, and overconfidence was thick, particularly in choke points like the South China Sea, the Java Sea, the Bungo Strait, and the coastal approaches to the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, areas the Japanese Navy believed were naturally protected by geography alone. Japanese officers, trained in a culture that prized decisive fleet battles and surface action, simply did not prioritize anti-submarine warfare in shallow water, a fatal oversight documented in post-war interrogations and in Japanese destroyer captain by Tameichi Hara, who admitted that escort doctrine lagged disastrously behind the reality of the submarine threat. And while Japanese merchant ships sailed with minimal zigzagging and inadequate sonar, Allied submarines, especially after torpedo defects were finally fixed in 1943, began sinking tankers carrying oil from Borneo, rice ships feeding island garrisons, and troop transports hugging coastlines for safety, turning those coastlines into graveyards. And the tragedy for Japan was not just the loss of ships, but the slow strangulation of its war economy, because unlike
the United States, Japan was an island empire, utterly dependent on sea lanes, a vulnerability that strategists like Admiral Yamamoto understood in theory but failed to counter in practice, as industrial limitations, inter-service rivalry, and doctrinal blindness combined to leave shallow water defenses underdeveloped. Allied submarine commanders such as Dudley Mush Morton, Eugene Fluckey, and Richard O'Kane became legends not by fighting fair, but by exploiting these assumptions, launching attacks from periscope depth in waters barely deep enough to submerge, sometimes even running on the surface at night within sight of land, using radar and surprise to devastate convoys that believed themselves protected by reefs and sandbanks. Tactics vividly recorded in war patrol reports and later analyzed by historians like Theodore Roscoe and Blair. And by 1944, the results were undeniable. Japan had lost millions of tons of shipping, oil reserves were collapsing, pilots were being grounded for lack of fuel, and entire island garrisons were being left to starve, all while Japanese officers continued to believe even then that submarines were a secondary threat compared to carrier strikes in surface battles, a misjudgment echoed in the minutes of Imperial Naval conferences and post-war analyses by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. The cruel irony is that the shallow waters the Japanese trusted most became the very places where Allied submarines achieved their greatest successes, because geography does not protect you when your enemy understands it better than you do, and by the time Japan attempted to adopt, laying more mines, deploying more escorts, improving sonar, the damage was irreversible. The arteries were already cut, and the empire was